Okay. Thanks very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here to talk to you today, and thanks so much to Andrew for that panorama of Wilkie's life and the start of his friendship with Charles Dickens. Right. This is not. Oh, that does it. Right, I'll just press the space bar. Wilkie's life and the start of his friendship with Charles Dickens. I'm going to talk to you about two things today. First, their last collaboration, No Thoroughfare, which we have a lot of evidence about. It was their closest collaboration in 1867 and 68. And then I'm going to talk to you about what I'm calling no cooling, because as Andrew said earlier, that a lot of Collins biographers, a lot of academics who write about Collins and Dickens, and a lot of Dickensians believe that although they were very, very close friends, and you heard that wonderful quote from Forster earlier, dearest and most valued friend, there is a suggestion that in the last years of Dickens' life, their relationship cooled. Indeed, the word estrangement is usually used, but that didn't happen. And that's the second part of my talk. So let me start with No Thoroughfare. There it is. This was to be the last of the Christmas numbers of All the Year Round. It's not really clear why Dickens decided that would be the last, but he did. They were very profitable. They boosted circulation. And of course, Dickens kept the vast bulk of the profits for himself. There was to be one final major number, and Dickens wrote to Collins, "Would you like to do the next Christmas number with me? We two alone, each taking half, and then we sort out the money, and I suppose our two names to be appended to the performance." Now, I looked at this collaboration in some detail, the work I did in 2020 at Buckingham University called Who Wrote No Thoroughfare, because the cover and the title page, which you just saw, simply said by Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. But who wrote which bits? And the problem is it was something they tried to hide. 6 years after it was published, and that was nearly 3 years after Dickens had died, Collins wrote in a letter to a publisher, "It's impossible for me to indicate correctly my share of the acts jointly written," that's 1 and 4, 2 Collins wrote and Act 3 Dickens wrote, but the ones they wrote jointly are 1 and 4. "We purposely wrote so as to make discoveries difficult, if not impossible." But it's not really true. The evidence is that even after the acts they wrote together, even in those, they each wrote particular bits, as you do. You don't write jointly with somebody. And if you look at their letters, it becomes clear that they wrote individual bits themselves. They sent copies to each other, they commented on them, but each was responsible for particular parts of those acts. Now, I say in their letters, we have 8 from Dickens to Collins during the time they were writing it, but of course we have none from Collins to Dickens because, as Andrew explained, in September 1860, Dickens decided he'd burn every letter he received, except business letters, and that was the moment when I often say the inimitable became the inimical. So we have no letters from Collins to Dickens at this time, but we do have a very useful source of information from Collins' side, his letters to his mum. Harriet Collins was central to the life of Wilkie and his brother Charles, particularly, sad to say, in the 20 years after their father died, William Collins. He was a Sabbatarian. He told his neighbour off for picking peaches on a Sunday. And Collins would write long letters to his mother, giving her news of his work, his successes, and of course, gossiping about others. Now, that's, of course, when she was young in 1831. That's how she was more in the 1860s. And incidentally, here's what Dickens said about her in 1861. "Old Mrs. Collins dined here last Sunday week and contradicted everybody upon every subject for 5 hours and a half and was invariably pig-headed and wrong. So I was very glad when she tied her head up in a bundle and took it home." But I digress. From 6 of those letters from Wilkie to his mother, we get lots of information about the progress of No Thoroughfare, like when he visited Dickens' home at Gad's Hill, for example, to discuss it, where they were with it. And from all those letters and a few others, we can deduce who wrote what. For example, Dickens said, "I have done the overture." Later, he said to Collins, "Have you done, or are you doing the beginning of the chapter Exit Wilding? I shall want it very soon." So we know that Collins did that bit. And let us arrange to culminate in a wintry flight and pursuit across the Alps. We shall get a very avalanche of power out of it and thunder it down on the readers' heads. And then later he said, Obenreizer, I'm racking my brains for a good death for that respectable gentleman. So you can deduce an awful lot from the letters about who wrote what, but then I found the gold dust, the actual real information, very largely ignored, almost completely apart from one person. Collins' manuscripts of his sections survive. And they fitted with the conclusions I'd drawn, I was very pleased to see, and they filled in a few gaps that I hadn't been able to fill in. And I can confirm that when Dickens said, I have done the greater part of it, and Collins said, nearly one half of No Thoroughfare was written by me, they were both right. Here is my analysis, section by section. And that shows that Dickens wrote 52% of the words in No Thoroughfare, and Wilkie Collins wrote 48%. And what about that final Act 4 you see there? And you see that we've decided who wrote what. Collins said it was impossible to say who wrote what. Remember that quote from him? Here it is again. And then he went on to say, I inserted passages in his chapters, he inserted passages in mine. I can only tell you that we, as near as possible, halved the work. And then he explained how they did that last. We put the story together in the Swiss chalet at Gad's Hill, the famous one given by Charles Flechter, and we finished the fourth act side by side at 2 desks in his bedroom at Gad's Hill. The reason they decamped to the house was because the weather that October weekend, 12th and 13th of October, I think it was just 8 degrees outside. So that unheated Swiss chalet was a bit chilly. Now, Dickens wrote the final words of No Thoroughfare, and he'd written the first words, you'll remember. He wrote, I've done the overture. But you know, he did something Collins would never do. He got the phase of the moon wrong. There was no full moon on the 30th of November, 1835. That is not a mistake Wilkie would have made. Collins wrote the plot reveal at the end involving lawyers and the legal niceties that sort of stitched everything together, and off it went to the printers. But that wasn't the end of their collaboration, because Collins turned No Thoroughfare into a play. Although the actor, Charles Flechter, with Dickens' approval, drew up the scenes and acts from the printed story, Wilkie wrote it, and he said this in 1873. The scenario was then placed in my hands, and the drama was entirely written by me. Wilkie Collins did write the whole play, though he had help from Flechter and the actor and impresario Benjamin Webster. But when you look at the cover, you see it still said by Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. Now, Wilkie was churning out 1,000 words a day of this play, and he was assiduous in sending acts to Dickens as he wrote them. And I won't read it, but this is his diary of the time. You can see 5th act corrected, sent to Dickens, sent in MSS to Dickens. The problem was Dickens was in New York and Boston, and it took 10 days for letters to get there and back. So Dickens actually wrote to Collins and said, what do you mean by the whole being left at my sole discretion? Is not the play coming out the day after tomorrow? So although Collins was sending him the stuff, he couldn't actually get Dickens' view back in time. Dickens also wrote this: I greatly doubt its success. But he was wrong. It played at the Adelphi Theatre in London for 151 nights. That's the programme for the 133rd night. And there's the final scene in the Illustrated London News. And the house sold out in the early weeks, and it stayed at 40% or higher until week 19. Here's a graph of the house of No Thoroughfare based on the takings, and we know precisely how much money was sent to Dickens and Collins. And when it fell below 40% here, no more money was paid to them. That was the sort of normal arrangement. But in those 19 weeks, they were paid £844. Now that's about £85,000 in terms of today's prices. The company then took it to the East End. They took it to Liverpool for another 40 nights. And a quite separate company took it on a tour of cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Leeds and Cardiff, another 100 nights of performances right through to nearly the end of 1868. And that took the total earnings for Dickens and Collins to almost £1,000 each. That was the most Wilkie or Dickens had ever earned from a dramatisation. So there they were. They collaborated over No Thoroughfare, they collaborated over the play, and they shared the proceeds equally. So, from No Thoroughfare to No Cooling. No estrangement, actually, as Wilkie's first biographer called it. Here it is. Kenneth Robinson, housing minister in the Labour government, wrote the first biography, and he wrote, there occurred some kind of personal estrangement between Dickens and Wilkie. Now, he based that on very slender evidence, just one phrase in one letter. But a few years later, it was followed up by a man called Arthur Adrian, who wrote Georgina Hogarth and the Dickens Circle. And he wrote a book, in that book, about Georgina, who that was, of course, was Dickens' sister-in-law, as you all know, and lived with Dickens for most of the rest of his life at Gad's Hill with the children. And Arthur Adrian used the same word as Robinson for the deteriorating relationship. He said he and Dickens became estranged. Now, he blamed this change on Dickens' dislike or resentment of his son-in-law. That was Charles Collins, Wilkie's brother. In 1860, he married Dickens' second daughter, Katie. Dickens, it was said, resented that marriage, disliked his son-in-law. Here's the full quote from Arthur Adrian. This attitude towards his brother aroused Wilkie Collins to such resentment that, according to Fechter, he and Dickens became estranged. Now, Adrian took this information about what Fechter thought from the diary of an American called Annie Fields. Now, she knew Dickens through her husband. He was a publisher in Boston, and they visited Dickens at Gad's Hill. Wilkie knew them too, and they knew Charles Fechter. And of course, Charles was involved in that No Thoroughfare production. Now, on the 30th of August, 1870, a couple of months after Dickens' death, Annie Fields was on a boat trip with Fechter, and she said, he talked much of himself, well, he did, Fechter, we know that, and his affairs, much too of his last visit to England, which of course included the time of Dickens' death. And she wrote that Fechter had found Charles Collins utterly overwhelmed by his father-in-law's death, adding that Wilkie Collins was a genuine mourner for him too, even though Wilkie Collins had been seriously estranged from Dickens because of his treatment of Charles, for the brothers are deeply attached. That, Annie Fields' diary is the source, the one single source for this idea of estrangement. And don't forget that Arthur Adrian was reporting what Annie Fields said, and she is reporting what Charles Fechter said during a long gossip on a boat trip about people they knew. And we know that the essence of what Annie reported, Fechter said, is not true. Fechter says Dickens took a strange dislike to him. That's Charles Collins. I think it was his dreadful and continued sickness. Now, Charles, we now know, was suffering from cancer of the stomach, which would kill him in 1873. But this view of Fechter's wasn't based on anything Dickens had said. Annie Fields' diary makes it clear that Fechter sort of deduced this view from how Dickens looked at Charles over the dining table. So the evidence of what Dickens thought of Charles comes down to Fechter's interpretation of how he looked at him at dinner. So let's look briefly at how Dickens actually treated Charles Collins. Charles was a brilliant artist, there's no question. He was a friend of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and his few paintings are in major exhibitions now. Here are 3 of them. But in 1856, he had a crisis of self-belief. Incidentally, Manchester, Oxford and Tate, I really recommend you go to see those pictures. Check that they're actually on the wall first. He had a crisis of self-belief about how good he was and whether he was only good because he copied his more brilliant friends like Millais. He set out his fears in a long document to another artist, Holman Hunt, and that led him to give up painting and concentrate on writing. Now, people used to think Dickens gave Charles Collins a few spots in All the Year Round because he was his son-in-law, a sort of early Nepo baby, as they'd say now. But it was very different from that. There was an index to All the Year Round in 1984 by Eliane Oppenlander, but she only found a quarter of the contributors, and some of those had one or more question marks by them. But then in 2017, a researcher and Dickens scholar called Jeremy Parrott bought a luxuriously bound edition of All the Year Round. And in the margins of this copy, Dickens' deputy editor, W.H. Wills, who you'll all have heard of, noted in pencil the author of every article. And here is one of them, which says Wilkie Collins. Jeremy Parrott's full findings will be published later this year, but I'm very fortunate that he shared a lot of this information with me. And I can tell you that Charles Collins, far from being the occasional contributor to All the Year Round, was a mainstay. There are their contributions. He was fourth in how much space he filled, above Charles Dickens. And if you look at the other contributions, he was fifth in those contributions that he wrote, just one below Dickens and well ahead of his brother Wilkie. That doesn't sound to me like someone Dickens despised or gave a bit of work to in sympathy. He may not have been very happy about his daughter's choice of husband. Most fathers aren't. He may perhaps have wished that Charles Collins was healthier and wasn't suffering such pain. And I'm sure Charles shared that view. But contrary to Fechter's speculations reported by Annie Fields, interpreted by Arthur Adrian, Dickens was very sympathetic to Charles. He wrote this to his son Alfred. Charlie Collins, I'm sorry to say, is very ill. Besides having spasmodic asthma, he has some mysterious illness originating in the brain, I fancy, which weakens him with continual sickness. He's in bed at present, but he's to be got down here, i.e. to Gad's Hill, as soon as he can be moved. And as I said, that mysterious illness turned out to be stomach cancer. There's really no evidence that Dickens in any way despised or disparaged Charles Collins, and that takes away any reason for Wilkie to be estranged from him. And there's one final thing I'd like to mention. That when Dickens embarked on his last book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, who did he pick to illustrate it? Charles Collins. He wrote, Charlie Collins has done a charming cover for the monthly part of the new book. And here it is. And giving away some of the plot that Dickens revealed exclusively, we now know, to Charles Collins. So right up to 1870, Dickens was giving his son-in-law not just work, but responsibilities, and giving Wilkie no cause to feel anger or resentment. So that's Charles. What about the evidence from Wilkie and their relationship? And again, there really isn't any evidence that their relationship cooled. I showed earlier No Thoroughfare was their closest collaboration, finished side by side, Dickens' desks in 1867, and they were closed right through to the end of 1868 when they shared those record proceeds of No Thoroughfare, the play. And after that, Wilkie remained a regular visitor to Dickens' house at Gad's Hill. Family parties like this. Here they all are. It's an enlargement of it. You can see them all there. Wilkie, Charles, his wife Kate, there's Dickens lounging on the grass. And Wilkie was also there on the 13th of February, 1869. And as he left, he asked Dickens for a signature for a friend who collected autographs. Dickens obliged with a signed and dated quote from A Christmas Carol. And Wilkie sent it to his friend later that day. Now this is described by the dealer who owns it as the holy grail for Dickens collectors, hence his price tag of $75,000, about £59,000. Anyone interested, I can put you in touch. Now, in October 1869, a few months after that, Collins wrote, I had a day at Gad's Hill a little while since, only the family, very harmonious and pleasant, except Dickens' bath, which dripped behind my head, the head of my bed all night. And then on the 27th of May, a few months after that, less than a fortnight before Dickens would die, Collins was again staying at Gad's Hill. Dickens wrote to Fechter, "Wilkie and Frank Beard so incessantly compliment each other, they're obliged to sit up all night, half the night together to get time to do it in. So we know their close relationship continued to the end." And Fechter, the source for the estrangement, knew that. The so-called evidence is very scant. I won't go into it. It's, I think, what academics would call over-reading of just 2 sentences in 2 letters. I'm going to be presenting a fuller story of that to the conference later in the year, so I won't do it now, but let me choose one final piece of evidence. Despite talking of Wilkie's estrangement, Fechter also said, as I mentioned, that Dickens, after Dickens' death, Collins was a genuine mourner, quote unquote, and so he was. Dickens died on the 9th of June, 1870, and Wilkie was one of 13 guests invited to his funeral 4 days later. Now, Dickens wanted to be buried privately in Kent, but it was decided he'd be better off in Westminster Abbey. And his family accompanied the body by train from Gad's Hill. Wilkie and a few others met them at Charing Cross with 3 coaches. And from there to Dickens' interment in Poets' Corner in the Abbey, we know every detail of that private funeral. How? Wilkie Collins wrote an account of it and sent it to William Stebbing of the Times. Here's his letter, which I won't read. That was his letter offering him the information, and it got there in time, and Stebbing wrote 1,000 words, setting out all those details that Collins had given about the cortege turning into Dean's Yard. A few people witnessed the burial of the plain oak coffin, no hymns, no chanting, no choir, just an organ playing. No one said amen. The clerk of works threw in some earth, and the mourners gathered round the grave, throwing in the flowers. And those details of this very private funeral, long before the public were allowed in, well, the morning before, and that's how it was when they were allowed in. This is the Illustrated London News. Before that, these details are only known because of Dickens' greatest friend, Wilkie Collins. And years later, in 1886, Collins said, "When I was with Dickens at Paris in 1855, we saw each other every day. We were as fond of each other as men could be. Nobody, my poor mother excepted, of course, felt so positively sure of the future before me in literature as Dickens did." That was written 16 years after Dickens died. So estrangement, cooling, all the evidence is the opposite. So when people tell you, or you read, that there was a falling out between Collins and Dickens, and that was caused by the way Dickens treated Collins' brother Charles, remember, none of that's true. They were the closest friends from when they met, beardless, in 1851, until Dickens' death in 1870, and into his own old age. Wilkie Collins remembered his dearest and most valued friend, Charles Dickens. Thank you. Oh, that's one of his bank accounts. I thought of showing you, but decided not to.